Conference Committee report on House Bill number 4772, an act relating to elections. The report is addressed to the Honorable Melissa Hortman, Speaker of the House, and the Honorable Bobby Joe Champion, President of the Senate. We, the undersigned conferees for House Bill number 4772, report that we've agreed upon the items in dispute and recommended as follows. The report is signed by all 3 members on the part of the House and all 3 members on the part of the Senate. Freiberg moves that the report of the Conference Committee on House Bill number 4772 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee.
I recognize the author, Representative Freiberg, who will explain the report.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, before you is the conference report for House File 4772, the Elections Bill. The Conference Committee met twice and took public testimony. We incorporated the elections budget into this bill. The conference report is signed by all 6 conferees, and thank you to the House conferees, Vice Chair Greenman, who is probably taking a much-needed break, and Representative Vernig. This bill includes great policy. Representative Greenman's Voting Rights Act is included in here, as well as a mechanism to help local governments finance it, should they need it. Representative Purcell's bill regarding polling places on college campuses is in here, and we heard the concerns of local governments, so we limited the language slightly and included a mechanism to fund those polling places as well. A host of other great policy provisions are in here. Representative Agbadje's bill requiring incarcerated people to be counted for census purposes in the district they're from is in here. Chair Stevenson's bill strengthening the deepfake law we passed last year is in here. Representative Hewitt's bill relating to vacancies in the offices of county attorney and sheriff is here. Now, there's been some confusion over lobbyist registration since we expanded it to local government, so this bill requires the Campaign Finance Board to study the definition of lobbyist and make recommendations to the legislature. We also included a stay of registration for individuals lobbying political subdivisions until we get the results of the study. Various other provisions, both House and Senate, are included in here. I won't list them all. A few of the Senate provisions, however, we accepted included applying the doxing law to elections officials, requiring local governments that administer elections to use a .gov domain, and clarifying language related to voter registration rolls. As I mentioned, this includes the elections budget. We had a small target, but we made the most of it. I've already mentioned the funding for the Voting Rights Act and the campus polling place provision. The budget transfers funds from 2 unusable accounts to the Voting Operations, Technology, and Election Resources, or voter account, that we created last year, as well as an additional $86,000. It includes $20,000 to fund Representative Coulter's bill requiring local campaign committees to file with the Campaign Finance Board. Those were all basically House positions. We did accept 1 Senate position on the budget. That was $50,000 for training campaign treasurers. This bill includes most of the GOP floor amendments that were adopted during discussion of the budget bill. Representative Quam, you had a good amendment prohibiting campaign loans from candidates to committees when the loan involves interest payments. Representative Altendorf, you had an amendment requiring candidates to provide proof of residence during candidate filing. Those are in here. We included Representative Johnson's amendment requiring the Secretary of State to review the Social Security Death Index. And we included Lead Torkelson's amendment making the campaign finance article effective date January 1st, 2025. In conclusion, we came up with a great bill that reflects the priorities of the Minnesota House and of Minnesotans. I encourage members to accept the conference committee report and pass the bill. I look forward to a robust, prolonged, maybe even Wagnerian debate on this bill, and welcome lots of questions. Feel free to start throwing them at me.
Discussion on the conference committee report. I recognize Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For many reasons, including Wagnerian ones, I move that we refuse to adopt the committee report.
Representative Torkelson moves to refuse the motion to
call.
adopt. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a motion. Representative Torkelson, or further discussion. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you. There's a lot about this bill that raises many questions. Let's start with the fact that we've rolled the budget process into the policy bill. Representative Freiberg, can you tell me when the Senate voted on these budget proposals?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for the question, Lead Torkelson. A budget bill did not pass the full Senate. It passed the Ways and Means Committee. We were given permission to negotiate the budget as part of this policy conference committee. You know, as often happens at the end of session, bills are getting rolled together. Many of the budget provisions are just funding the policy provisions that we talked about already, so there is a pretty clear correlation between the two.
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Freiberg, for that explanation, but the fact remains the Senate did not vote on most of these budget proposals. Only the conference committee voted. There's also a major issue dealing with lobbying. There's what I would call a bait and switch going on here. There was a fix that was incorporated in the bill regarding expert testimony or expert input of information that made perfect sense. The flow of information is critical to our work and the work of local governments. Can you explain why there was a bait and switch?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Lead Torkelson. I would refute the premise that this was a bait and switch. We are basically just maintaining the status quo. We heard, as I mentioned, we took public testimony during the conference committee. We heard how, the language was included in the House, and an even broader, this is a carve-out that would allow various activities that I think the public would have an interest in knowing about go unreported. The Senate language was even broader. It would, we heard examples in the conference committee potentially of company CEOs meeting with legislators, sports teams owners talking about stadiums meeting with local officials. These are things, if they rise to the threshold to constitute lobbying, I think the public would want to know about that. And as I mentioned, we are doing a study on the impact on what constitutes a lobbyist, what sorts of activities should be requiring. So in light of the fact that it turned out this language was maybe broader than we intended, it seemed to make sense to wait until the results of the study, because the Campaign Finance Board is going to come back with recommendations to us, and we can incorporate those. And hopefully at that point, it will be more narrowly drawn. It will respect the goals of the lobbying community, not to have to, report things when they don't need to, but it would also, most importantly, respect the right of the public to know who is attempting to influence actions of government.
Representative Torkelson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Freiberg. There's a problem there, and we know it. Would Representative Stevenson yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Torkelson.
Thank you. Representative Stevenson, your portion of this bill deals with the deep fake. Can you explain, there were some changes in the potential penalties in here. Can you explain those changes?
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Torkelson. I believe that the changes to the penalties include allowing disqualification for office, but that was in the bill that passed off the House floor and was heard in committee and all of the rest.
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If Representative Stevenson would yield for more questions.
He will yield. Representative Torkelson.
So I understand that the proof of negligence in this case, the language around that has changed. Can you explain that, Representative Stevenson?
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Torkelson. Yes, you're talking about how we changed the standard. We raised the standard from negligence, or I guess it depends on your perspective, raised or lowered, from negligence to recklessness, making it harder to establish liability under the deepfake statute. That was actually an amendment that was adopted in the bill's last committee stop, which I think was judiciary in the House, and so would have been in the House bill as it left the House floor. But that is the change that you're referencing. It brings the standard in alignment with the standard for libel. So it moves it to recklessness from negligence.
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If Representative Stevenson would continue to yield. So someone does this reckless deep fake action and is convicted of it. For how long will they be barred from holding public office?
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Torkelson. I don't have the language right in front of me. My recollection is that it's a disqualification from the current contest if it was the candidate in question. I'm not sure if it's longer than that. I can certainly pull up the language and look at it again, but that's my off the top of the head recollection.
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Stevenson. Well, I think you probably have time to pull that up, and we'll talk about that later in the evening once you have established exactly what's going on there. I'm going to end my remarks for now, Madam Speaker, but we had 3 goals as Republican members of this committee. One, that an elections bill would actually be bipartisan, and frankly, a few amendments, minor amendments on the House floor does not make this a bipartisan bill. Just the fact that there were no Republicans on the conference committee is another indicator that the voices of Republicans have been ignored for the most part throughout this process. Our second goal was to actually improve election security. We have a provision in this bill that allows people to register to vote without an address. We don't even know for sure what district they're going to be in or how long they might be at that address. And finally, we wanted to increase public confidence in our election system. We know that in the media today, there's lots of questioning about the veracity of our election system. There's nothing in this bill that improves public confidence. This is not the bipartisan, down-to-earth elections bill that we need, we didn't get, and I reinforce my motion to vote against this bill.
Discussion on the motion. I recognize the member from Crow Wing, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, here we go again. Representative Freiberg, would you yield for, Madam Speaker, would Representative Freiberg yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Freiberg, why were there no Republican voices invited in on the conference committee?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Davis. The decision to appoint conferees is slightly above my pay grade. The policy bill, which this came from, did not have a lot of support from Republicans off the floor. The budget bill that we did pass off the floor did, and again, that decision to incorporate the budget provisions here was also not one that I made. However, I imagine that bill did have bipartisan support going off the floor. Had there been a more normal process on that in the Senate, I think there probably would have been GOP members on the budget conference committee. However, that did not end up happening, as Lead Torkelson noted.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Representative Freiberg. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Freiberg continue to yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Davis.
Representative Freiberg, do you believe that it would have been a good idea, a good bipartisan effort to invite Republican voices onto the conference committee?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Davis. Sure. I mean, especially I think on the budget bill, I think that would have been helpful since there were several Republican provisions accepted there. I was assuming, I think at the time the policy committee was appointed, that we would have a separate committee on the budget, but that did not happen. I did my best to incorporate the GOP provisions that we passed off the floor on the budget bill, and I think we got something like 4 out of 5 of them. So certainly a diversity of views is always helpful, but it didn't end up happening here.
Representative Davis.
Thank you for that honesty, Representative Freiberg, and I asked that question because I knew you'd be honest with me, so thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I point out the chair of the Elections Committee feels that it would be important to have a bipartisan voice on the conference committee by inviting in Republicans. He confessed it would be that'd be a good idea. So this should be a really easy vote. Let's refuse to adopt this. Representative Torkelson pointed out that there was not a single Republican on the conference committee. Could you have at least one on the bill that has to do with elections, which the Democrat governor of the state of Minnesota said that legislation passed for elections should have bipartisan support. And I know what the argument might be there, but oh, we allowed a few things in this bill, though, that was your guys' idea. Come on. Throwing us a couple of bones so that you can say you have bipartisan support is not bipartisan support. There's one party in this state that is forming, constructing, crafting how our elections work in the state of Minnesota. One-party rule is doing that. The Democrat trifecta is doing that in the state of Minnesota. You do not have bipartisan support. And this bill, it's got other problems. I'll probably speak more to this stuff later tonight, if we get there. There's nothing in here for election integrity. Doesn't spend a single dime on election integrity. In fact, spends another $500,000 in 24-25, $200,000 in 26-27. Money that we actually don't have to implement because of a wasted $18 billion and the growing of government by nearly 40%. And I can see it on your face, you're tired of being lectured to. Well, then listen. Let's stop shutting out the voices of half of Minnesota, because that's literally what you're doing when you don't listen to us on something that is supposed to have bipartisan support, according to the Democrat governor of Minnesota. Elections. Elections, that's a big deal. And I will promise you this, that Minnesotans, because I hear from them, Minnesotans' confidence in our elections has absolutely been shaken. The people of Minnesota, their confidence in our elections has been shaken. And you're passing legislation that's going to erode their confidence even more. I'm sitting in committee looking at a bill, hearing about a bill where if you want to vote in the state of Minnesota, you just got to give a description of where you live. Yeah, that'll really increase voter confidence. That'll really add election integrity to the state of Minnesota. It's just more of the same. So I will continue to lecture about these things and to let the voice of my district be heard, because they don't want these things. And when and if we get to it, I know you'll pass this, because one thing I've learned being here in my second year is this is kind of just theater here on this House floor. You've already made up your minds. You've already got the votes. But I would highly encourage you to stop shutting out the voice of half of Minnesota. Let's start right here. Let's vote green on the refusal to adopt. And I said this, was it last week or the week before? Let's truly make Minnesota elections great again, because right now they are not. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'll start out with what's in the bill. The spending. A lot of the discussion on the spending items was to increase turnout. But amazingly, it was focused at areas that already have a high percentage turnout, but totally neglected areas with low percentage turnout, which tended to be in greater Minnesota. If we're going to spend money to try and improve turnout on elections, let us actually look at the districts where we need to bring up that percentage of turnout and what would help with that. Another point, incarcerated persons redistricting. It was discussed in committee, someone that hasn't lived outside of the system since before the previous redistricting on a new redistricting gets to pick a place to say where he lives. I asked for clarification because there are instances where there are no longer houses or apartments where they live because there was highway construction, there were maybe major industrial expansions. Things happen in 10, 15 years. But we're going to magically pick a location that doesn't even have an address anymore. Well, federal law requires there be an address. Federal law on their verification site that Minnesota actually submits to requires an address. And there was an audit preceding the pandemic and all the controversy about election and fraud and et cetera. There was an audit by the legislative auditor on the registration system. And during the presentation of that, I noticed that the numbers didn't seem to be correct or accurate. They were off by thousands. So I asked a question. And what ended up coming out is the Secretary of State's office withheld the information from the federal verification site listed in HAVA of over 16,000 bad registrations. 16,000 bad registrations. They didn't even inform the auditors. Anyone that looks back not even too far in our history, we have had elections statewide decided by a few hundred votes. 16,000 is large enough to decide statewide races and multiple House and Senate races. That's not trivial, people. And so they just, it didn't come to mind. So let's say it's an accident. They did an additional sampling audit after that, and they found irregularities in some counties weren't cleaning their voter rolls. And people that were flagged for bad registrations and challenged and et cetera by the processes in our law, they just went ahead and voted in those counties. And you wonder why there are people that don't believe in the quality of our election system when there is proof that we've got issues. Instead of addressing those issues, we didn't spend money on doing that kind of thing, but we decided in a policy bill to say, we don't care that you don't have an address. We don't care that you haven't lived there through multiple redistrictings. We're going to count you where you don't live. When long-standing policy, law, interpretation, etc., has been that what precinct you're in is where you sleep, your bedroom. Because there have been cases where lines were drawn, they split a apartment building, and you're in different districts. So an actual exact address is not only not trivial, the lack of it violates the systems that federal election law dictate be followed to have a verified good registration. Because it's not just incarcerated, it's anyone can just say, oh, I live sort of in between this area over here, and there is no postal address, so there's no way you would pass as being a valid registration according to federal law and the federal systems we have had for many years. Add into that there was, some years ago, a member of this body, she's not a member anymore, but she was running in a primary, and there were hundreds of people registered at a P.O. box store. And when that sampling audit was done, they discovered that there were multiple people registered and voting from that P.O. box store that were convicted of voter fraud. So I guess she was right. I think she sat in the back row over there. She was right when she said there's something wrong. So the multiple locations where you have issues with not having an actual address are right for us to, if there's federal elections, like I think there's Senate, there's a presidential, it's right for a challenge in federal courts that we're violating federal election law, and that probably won't be a cheap thing. That'll be quite expensive. But then again, Minnesota's getting in the habit of violating federal law and losing court cases. So let's move on to polling locations on campuses. In the committee, I brought up that in my district, there's a precinct that has different school districts, which means in that single precinct, they have multiple different ballots for people. And there are brought up examples of where there are multiple different ballots for many college campuses. A lot of students don't live in the dorms or a frat. They live off campus. And it's nice and convenient to vote on campus. However, are they going to have a half dozen different ballots of sufficient quantity to actually give the student the right ballot? Actually, no, because that's not even happening regularly with our current system and precincts in the counties, because I know of several elections where that's been a problem. And they had to go back in and hand count and the judge ended up making a determination, but it was not accepted by everyone because, of course, in Minnesota, we don't have provisional ballots, which is federal law required by HAVA, again, where Minnesota doesn't actually abide by HAVA. We did get an exemption from actually having to follow federal election law on that point, but not on the address point. So we go to college campuses and they can snap their fingers and force a polling location with too short of a time to actually ensure that they have the ballots and all the information and they can do it appropriately. And, you know, frankly, the largest, outside of a few years ago when there was a thing with felon voting, the largest group of people that have been convicted of voter fraud and voting illegally have been college students, and not of their own fault, generally. But here, we're going to say, we're going to make it easier to snap our fingers when it's too late to actually do the appropriate upfront work and force a polling location there with the likely outcome of having issues with the ballots. So we'll go down to school board appointment provision. I suggested that if there were more than 2 already appointed, that there had to be an election. People say, well, that's not likely. In the last general election, in the school district I live in, 6 of the 7 seats were on the ballot because they had basically half the school board resign after 2 years. You know, that again, the turmoil because of COVID and everything else going on, it was probably somewhat of an unusual situation. But it is not, in my mind, keeping the power in the people. If you can have a majority of the board appointed by a portion of the board without the voters getting a say for about 2 years. Because besides the queasiness I have on the voters should decide, I know to succeed in a school, you need the buy-in and connection with the community. And having the people on the board not be elected by the community, I can guarantee will make it more difficult for that board to function. So the suggestion that we have it in the next local election apparently didn't make it, because maybe it actually did something instead of a minor little thing. The component that I did with an amendment was things that happened in the U.S. of where there were a few people that gave their campaigns a personal loan and were being paid back interest. I don't think that's happened in Minnesota, But let's just make sure that it doesn't. So that's where that came from. We should not be making a profit off of our campaign funds. And, that was a simple thing, but it wasn't as important as all of the amendments, all the unheard bills by the committee that would have made an actual improvement and difference, would have improved our voter turnout in the parts of the state which are 10, 20% below our state average for turnout. Because maybe I'm odd, common sense says to me, we want to improve low voter turnout. I'm going to look where there's low voter turnout and actually try to address it there. So that's getting into the area of things not in the bill. And frankly, for probably a decade or more, I've been trying to get us towards fully obeying and abiding by federal election law. Provisional ballots were said, oh, that will make it so we can't have same-day registration. No. If another state has done it, which it has, Minnesota can do it. Oh, it'll be too costly. Or complex, whatever the reasoning on that end, if over 96% of the people living in the United States live where there are provisional ballots, my goodness, what is the excuse that Minnesota doesn't provide that which will guarantee enfranchisement, which says everyone that goes to a poll can cast a ballot if, on those few occasions where there's a concern, they do a provisional ballot. And then you can verify and count that ballot. Other states can do it. I believe Minnesota is capable and intelligent enough to actually do what the vast majority of the states in the United States do. To enfranchise like over 90% of the citizens of the United States are enfranchised by this. But, that one either doesn't doesn't really get heard as a bill, gets heard as an amendment. And that's why I don't think we're having what we have had in the past is actual bipartisanship on the election bills. And with previous governors, that was required. I remember 10 years ago when we had another trifecta. Same situation with a trifecta. I remember that no election bill went through that was not bipartisan. We're able to do that. We're able to do that for the people of the state. Show them that we could work together with bipartisanship, because that was important to the governor and to the members and to the people. That's why it's disappointing that the elections bills this year maybe had a little bit of, a few stickers from Republican ideas, mainly technical, but no really impactful input was allowed in the bills. And frankly, I've been majority and minority multiple times. And I know one of them's funner, but it's still our responsibility to be the voice and to represent our people and the people of Minnesota. And I if you've been in committee with me, I do hear both sides. And in fact, a lot of the committees, even though it's something that I would not support, I bring up ways that they could improve or avoid unintended consequences. And I've been pleased many times to where we've been able to do that. I'm not seeing that in the present bill. And at times it has been frustrating, and I apologize. My voice went above a 2 or a 3. I think I hit a 4. But I get texts and messages and phone calls and emails from constituents that they're watching, they're listening. And a fair amount of what I bring up comes because they say, be sure to touch on this point or talk about this. Or ask this question because they're confused. And that's part of our job here in the back and forth and discussion. And obviously, I don't have any amendments to this because it went to conference committee. Obviously, I didn't have any input because I wasn't on the conference committee. And I think nobody from my side was on it or in the Senate. Because I oftentimes have senators talk to me and say, you know, what's happening on this bill? Do you have any suggestions? It's just a little bit disappointing, and I apologize if I get a little energetic in my discussions, but we're all passionate for the people. We just don't always agree on the priorities, and I'm sorry that this bill doesn't rise to the bar that I can support. I'll be voting against accepting it. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Mauer, Representative Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. You know, I know that you've probably been hearing a lot of the same things, but I just want to reiterate some of the points that we've heard from some of my other colleagues. You know, I was a part of the COVID class, and several of you who came in with me as well understand one of the things that was probably the most frustrating is watching election law be changed, not through the legislature, but just unilaterally changed by the Secretary of State. And that caused questions, that caused concerns, and it caused people to have doubt in the process. And, you know, our job as public servants, you know, we don't get our job without votes. We don't get our job without votes. And it's our duty to be public servants. In order to do that, we need to convince the public that we are their best representatives. It's in our best interest to have transparent election law. It is in our best interest, whether it's from the right or the left, it is in our best interest to have a clear, transparent election law that is full of integrity and it is implemented with fidelity. And so that's why this bill that's in front of me is so frustrating, because some of the things that were changed that caused doubt, that caused concerns, still have not been fixed. And instead, we're adding even more things that will cause more doubt and cause more concern. I cannot vote and will actually vote in favor to refuse to adopt and send it back to conference because of three main things. The first one is that procedurally this just isn't ready. By putting both the policy and the finance together after the Senate has not gone through the finance side is just irresponsible. It's not, as a person as part of the minority, it's not my job to time management. It's not my job to figure out how to put your agenda together. And the fact that you ran out of time just simply is an excuse, and it's not okay. You need to be able to have all things go through all the process so that there can be transparency, there can be public testimony, that there can be, that we're able to have public viewing of what is happening. All of that needs to happen before you shove everything into a 50-some-odd page bill and say vote on it. It's not okay to shirk the process. And so for that first reason, I cannot vote for this bill and will be choosing to vote green on refusing to adopt. The second reason is because of this super sketch. Sorry, I was a high school teacher for a long time. I'm using the word sketch. The super sketch provision here on page 11, where 11.7 through 11.14, where we don't even have to have a full address. And for people who are watching, Minnesotans, and you want election integrity, and you know that you have to show ID, even if it's not a driver's license, you have to show something that proves your address. Like, that is very common to have to do. It is not difficult. It's not an abnormal thing to prove residency. But this is what the language actually says, Minnesotans. This is what it says. It says if there is an address, basically, the description if there's a specific physical address lacking, you can provide a physical description of the location. This is 11.9. The description must be sufficient for the county auditor to identify and correct precinct for the voter. The description may include the closest cross street to the nearest address described, and the directions from the cross street or the address to the described location, including but not limited to, and then it goes on, the approximate distance to the location. That doesn't sound very certain. That doesn't sound like we're trying to have our elections done with integrity. That doesn't sound like something that will give confidence to those who are voting. It is a privilege in this country to be able to vote. It is a privilege. And with someone who has several refugees in my area, and I am so proud to represent my refugees who have spent 5 years living in this country and then having the privilege to be able to vote for the first time, it is so exciting to watch them exercise their right as a citizen of this country to be able to vote for the first time as an American citizen. They are so excited to do that. And provisions like this do not bring confidence, do not bring integrity. And so I cannot, for that second reason, I cannot vote for this bill, and I will be voting green to refuse to adopt. And then the last one, and I know, we heard, oh gosh, all the days blur together, but we heard one of the hardest things to do as a legislator is to stand up against your friends, to stand up against people who actually support you and you often find in agreement with. I understand that there are lobbyists who have come and said that this provision on page 520 to 522, who are normally in agreement with me, say this is a good thing. I am saying today it is not. And let me tell you what it is. It is where a school board can simply appoint to fill a vacancy. 520, notwithstanding paragraph A, if the vacancy occurs less than 2 years prior to the expiration of the term, no special election is required, and the appointee of the board shall serve for the remainder of the unexpired term subject to paragraph D. I understand friends of mine think that this is a good idea because it will save money. Does not breed confidence, does not breed integrity, and actually denies the people who pay taxes that actually support the school to have a voice in their own representation. The people who are going to be making rules for the school, who are going to decide how to implement the laws that we pass up here, the people who fill that position and represent the taxpayers of that district, they don't get a voice in that because it's too expensive, it's too hard. No. If we need to have a different solution where the state comes and helps pay for some of those things because it is more expensive, that's fine. Let's talk about that. But that's not even in the discussion here. That's not even in the discussion. It's like, let's just get rid of it. You don't get to Minnesota. This provision gets rid of your voice. This gets rid of your choice. This gets rid of your ability to decide who represents you and your children on the school board. That's un-American. It's not okay. We get to have a voice and a choice and a vote. And I'm sorry to normally my friends, but in this instance, you are wrong. You are wrong, and it is important for you to understand that just because it saves money doesn't mean that this is a good idea. Let's find a different way. This is not right. This does not breathe confidence. It does not breathe integrity. It does not allow as much participation as possible. For a political party that says that representation matters, this is totally contrary to that, completely contrary to that. So, because of the three reasons, I cannot choose to vote for this. Instead, I will be voting green to refuse to adopt and send it back to conference, see if we can fix some of this stuff, see that we can actually send it through the appropriate processes, and that we can have complete integrity and complete confidence in our elections. And with that, members, I would urge you to join me in voting green for the motion to refuse to adopt and send it back to conference. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Anoka, Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. There are lots of reasons to send this back, and we've heard some of them touched on. I think it's important, again, that we remember that until last year, many governors for many years, both Republican and Democrat and independent, expected us as a legislature to put together bipartisan election bills for a very sensible reason, because the public has skepticism and should have skepticism about single-party control ramming through election bills for the benefit of one single party, that the legislature might get hijacked to try to not create free and fair elections, but to create elections that are more likely to favor the one party that's the only party at the table, such as this conference committee report that we're considering, where, again, there wasn't a single Republican on the conference committee. But this bill is even worse than that, because instead of just having legislation pass through the legislature that favors one party, it creates an opportunity for election laws to be changed in the future, even outside of the democratic process, through the courts, through sue and settle litigation, in what is misnamed as the Minnesota Voting Rights Act, what is a law trying to take concepts from the federal Voting Rights Act that don't make sense in the context of our state election laws. We have a federal Voting Rights Act that's attempting to implement the 14th Amendment against the states. Because we don't have a federal voting election system, the federal government has one tool, and that's the Voting Rights Act. And I understand that there are folks on the other side of the aisle who don't like a circuit interpretation of federal law that would apply to federal law cases against the state of Minnesota. So they think it's important to, for symbolic purposes or for sue and settle purposes in the future, to do this Voting Rights Act. It's a horrible idea. We've discussed it ad nauseum. But the most important thing that people need to understand is that the supposed party of democracy is trying to create a mechanism, an anti-democratic mechanism to change election law in the future, where activist groups and election lawyers can sue the state of Minnesota or can sue our political subdivisions and get maybe collusive settlements or judicial decisions that will change election law in the future through the courts or through a court settlement. That's not democracy. That's not something that should be passed. And that's definitely not something that should be passed on a purely partisan basis in a purely partisan election law. But there's more. There's more that should be very concerning about this bill. It tries to, and it builds on misguided changes that were passed through last year that changed the electioneering definition to, again, try to burden speech that people want to give to criticize what happens in this place. So the folks in charge here want to prevent people from criticizing or make it harder for people to criticize what happens in this place by doing changes to the election, by expanding what's called electioneering. And you have to kind of follow along through a few different pages of this bill to fully understand what's going on. But they for example, on page 75, change the definition of electioneering communication to include communications that are happening within 30 days before a convention of a political party unit that has the authority to endorse a candidate. What do you think that's about, huh? Who's interested in preventing or burdening communication that might happen within 30 days of an endorsing convention? Interesting. That's what we're trying to regulate here. And what level of communications are we trying to regulate? Well, that's in the targeted to a relevant electorate definition on page 73, starting on page 73, but on page 74, it includes, in the case 74, line 12, in the case of a communication disseminated by telephone in a digital format online or other electronic means, so like, Facebook ads or something like that, that are 7419 are capable of generating 2,500 or more contacts within a district. So what we're doing is we're trying to make it, what this law is trying to do is trying to make it more difficult, more burdensome for people to talk to other people in the district, and things that might just happen to be capable of generating 2,500 or more contacts. Think about a Facebook ad or a text message within a district. It just happens to be, targeted at the period right before an endorsing convention. Who do you think benefits from making it harder to communicate about issues to people in a district, maybe, a couple thousand people in a district, 3,000 people in a district, before an endorsing convention? So whose interests are we really protecting in this bill? And by we, I don't mean me. I mean, again, the completely partisan Democrat conference committee, again, building on the completely partisan Democrat elections bills that were rammed through last year. They're also trying to burden those who might provide us with information, but only certain people who might provide us with information. We heard some discussion earlier about the subject matter expert definition, and I did have a question for Representative Freiberg, if he will yield. I can't see him over there.
He will yield. Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Freiberg, you said something that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to make sure I was understanding the subject matter expert language. I don't see any subject matter expert language that made it into the final bill. Could you point me to where the subject matter expert language is in the bill?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for the question, Representative Niska. Are you talking, could you clarify your question, please? I'm wondering if you're discussing the provision that had been in the House and Senate version, carving out disclosure of lobbying communications to local officials. Is that what you're referencing?
Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Freiberg, you had made a comment that both the House and the Senate language had broader language than what ended up in the conference committee report. That was the comment that I was referring to, and I was wondering if you could direct us to the language in the conference committee report you were referencing in that comment.
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Niska. No, I cannot, because we did not include the language that had a broader impact. So it's not in the conference report because it would be very broad, and we want to wait for the results of the study.
Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So again, listen very carefully and think about the process of what happened here. So both the House and the Senate passed language on this topic, and then the conference committee report has no language on the topic. The all-DFL conference committee just decided to delete that provision altogether. And let me explain a little bit for people to understand a little bit what's going on. So Minnesota law has a threshold where anyone who gets paid $3,000 in a certain year to do anything influencing legislative action. Legislative action is very broad. It includes even just contemplating potential legislation. So you're not even legislation that's going through the legislature, potential legislation. That was kind of bungled up in last year's, DFL trifecta one-party elections bill. And it creates a situation where a lot of people are uncertain about whether just legal research about legislation is covered, or a lobbyist bringing in a particular person, maybe, for example, just as a total random hypothetical, a D.C. lawyer or law firm who's an expert in how to criminally prosecute state troopers, a D.C. law firm that might charge $850 an hour. If they spend more than 3.6 hours doing any research or helping out or having any meetings just to provide us with information or to maybe or even to think about potential future legislation, that might trip lobbyist reporting requirements. It might or might not. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that this is not really very clear. So that's the problem that's created here, or that was created here last year, and that there was a lot of discussion about needing to fix, and there was a lot of discussion about potentially fixing that, and both the House and the Senate versions tried to deal with that problem, and the all-DFL conference committee said, no, we're going to keep the status quo in place, as Representative Freiberg said, which means keep in place the all-Democrat version that was jammed through last year, that bungled up this area of the law. We're going to keep that in place. We're going to do a study, and then we're going to come back. And Representative Freiberg, I did have a question about that study, if he will yield.
He will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Freiberg, the study, I think it says that it's going to look at the definition of lobbyist and principal and try to understand whether there's any particular changes that need to be made. I was wondering, in existing law, and this is in your bill or in the conference committee report at 68.23, existing law defines lobbyists specifically to not include a public official. And my question, Representative Freiberg, would be, is the problem of public officials being employed by lobbyist principals and the potential problems and potential need for reporting on that, is that something that is going to be considered in the study by the Campaign Finance Board under your bill?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Niska. The language says that the study and recommendation must focus on whether the law does or should distinguish between the activities that constitute lobbying of a public official and activities that constitute lobbying of a local official. I did use the time to pull up also the language that's not included there, and it's basically I've heard it, based on our testimony we heard in the conference committee, I heard it described as a CEO lobby loophole or a corporate expert loophole. This provision is just about disclosure. If you're paid enough to influence the government and you do enough of it, the public has a right to know. It's really not that complicated.
Representative Niska.
Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you, Representative Freiberg. I think if I heard the answer to that question right, and I'm hopeful that I heard the answer to that question right. It does sound like that's something that the Campaign Finance Board should be studying as part of the study you're directing them to do, is this really potentially significant problem of elected officials being employed by lobbyist principals, and whether the definition of lobbyist or lobbyist reporting should be changed to deal with that. I hope that's true. If that is true, that might be the only good thing that comes out of this bill. But again, members, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this bill. In particular, we should be very concerned about the fact that the conference committee took a provision that passed in both the House and the Senate, or took instead to reconcile similar provisions that passed both the House and the Senate. The way it reconciled them was by just deleting both of them, again, with the idea that it's some sort of CEO lobbying loophole, as opposed to just being, I don't know, like a step-toe lobbying, a step-toe advising loophole or something like that. But in all seriousness, it is important for us to allow, or to be, to get information from subject matter experts. I had the experience this year of being in a committee hearing in which, before the committee hearing, it seemed like one piece of legislation was completely uncontroversial, and it turned out at that committee hearing that some very educated, focused, and attentive folks, including some attorneys, actually had some really serious problems with it, and they weren't able to communicate with us, and it was hard for them to track that and communicate with us before that hearing because they hadn't hired a lobbyist. So there are a lot of problems with our legislative process that we should be pretty sensitive to, and not just assuming that anybody that we label as a lobbyist is somebody that's having a negative, bad effect on our process. We just saw, I guess, passed a junk fee provision, which affects a broad range of businesses, and only a few businesses that were able to bring lobbyists to the Capitol were able to get specific guidance about how it was going to affect their businesses. There's all kinds of small businesses in Minnesota that can't afford lobbyists, that can't afford a specific person to come here and track the legislation that's happening here, and they're getting harmed by the legislation that's happening here. And so it is important. We should all be humble about some of the legislation that's passing here, and be willing to listen to people who have more expertise than we do. And this bill shuts a lot of that out, and it's not a good bill. It, again, should go back to conference committee so that the conference committee can think about how to deal with this subject matter expert issue instead of just deleting it from the bill altogether. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Goodhue, Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members. Thank you, Representative Torkelson, for recommending to send this back to the conference committee. Sitting on the elections committee the last 2 years, one thing that, I think all Minnesotans would agree on is that our confidence in the election system has been shaken. And I would like to see this committee work together more in a bipartisan fashion to really rebuild that confidence. And why wouldn't we? I know we like to boast that we have a high turnout here in Minnesota on our elections. Why don't we take that to another level and make sure that we have this bipartisan support, that our elections are secure, and that we have boosted the confidence of all people in Minnesota, not just one side. Instead, what we have really seen in the last few years is extended voting. We are up to 46 days of voting. And what was disappointing, and sometimes people would ask me when I'm back home or in the district, not everyone follows the political process as closely as we do, of course. And, they say, what bills have you had heard? Or what are you working on specifically in a committee? And when the majority party is in charge, they get to decide what bills are being heard in the committees. And oftentimes, the public is just not aware that that's what's happening. But that is the bonus of being the majority party. So the Republicans have most certainly written bills. And some of those bills, if I may share them with you, are provisional ballots. That is a bill that the Republicans have written and tried to discuss, tried to amend onto bills, and has been regularly denied. And yet, Minnesota is an outlier on provisional ballots. The majority of states have provisional ballots, which just means when there is some uncertainty of the day of voting, that ballot is securely set aside and it's able to be verified at a later time. Why would we not do something that's so common sense like that, members? That is a bill that the Republicans have supported, and the majority party continues to deny this common sense legislation that would build security, build confidence in our elections. Another thing that the Republicans have authored is paper ballots. Now, interestingly enough, as I'm sitting here, I looked up what is the popularity of paper ballots, and 2022 Gallup poll, 8 out of 10 would like to have a paper ballot backup. Even in the case that electronic machines are used, that we have that paper ballot, that we have that hardcore proof that we can go back and we can look at. And why would we not do that, members? Why would we not have paper ballots? That was a Gallup poll in 2022. Another poll I found, Pew Research, just in February of 2024, 82% of Americans want paper ballots. Even if they're not using them, if the machine is using, it's an electronic voting machine, they want the hard copy paper ballot that then can be verified. That seems very common sense. That seems very reasonable. 82% of people want that. Another bill that the Republicans have offered is photo ID. And that is one that holds an 81% of Americans want photo ID to vote in their elections. That seems very common sense. Why are we not listening to these bills, majority party? Why are we not allowing any of the Republican bills that we have authored, co-authored, or tried to amend on bills? Why are these not being heard in the Elections Committee? Why do we not have a goal to make this election bill a bipartisan support, to build confidence, so that we can look at all Minnesotans in the eye and that they can be reassured that our elections are secure? Photo ID, as I said, is an 81% popularity. What do you need a photo ID for? Obviously to drive, to drink, not to do those two together. You need a photo ID at airports to fly. You need a photo ID to work. You need a photo ID to write a check, although to my kids, that seems like that's like a really old thing and they don't do that anymore. You need a photo ID to start your bank account. You need a photo ID to purchase a firearm. You need a photo ID to rent a car. And the list goes on. Photo ID is very popular. This is not a Republican, not a GOP thing. Photo ID is very, very popular. And quite frankly, it's insulting to all the people that go and vote that we are not asking all people to show that photo ID, just simply verifying that they are a citizen and they are eligible to vote. Quite honestly, that is insulting. It is insulting that we are not providing this confidence to Minnesotans when 81% of the population would like photo ID to vote. So with this election bill, we did nothing to bolster our confidence, nothing to bolster the security, to make it more transparent. But we certainly added, didn't we? We added, and we made it more complicated for our local governments. We made it more expensive for our local governments. 46 days of voting. One of the new provisions, Representative Purcell's bill, Madam Speaker, would Representative Purcell yield to a question?
She will yield.
Okay, Representative Purcell, where we are now asking for polling locations to pop up on a college campus. If our goals are for security in elections, what are we doing to make sure that those polling places are secure to our Minnesota voters?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. A pop-up early voting location on a college campus or any location, specifically like on reservations like we passed last year, will have the same security as other voting locations.
Representative Altendorf.
Madam Speaker, thank you, Representative Purcell, and will Representative Purcell continue to yield to another question?
She will yield.
Representative Purcell, how can you verify that the transporting of ballots are completely secure to and from the government facility to the college campus and then back again? What does that transportation of ballots look like to you?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. Just like there are multiple polling locations in a city or a county, and then those go back to a central location, that would continue to be the case.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Purcell. Will Representative Purcell continue to yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Altendorf.
Okay, Madam Speaker, members, in the case that we have these pop-up polling situations, in a normal election day type polling place, there would be election judges, polling judges, representative from both parties. How can you reassure that there will be bipartisan judges overseeing the elections at pop-up polling?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. My understanding, when I went to early vote at my city hall, there was the staff person who was employed by the city at that location.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Purcell. Right now, in our local governments, one thing that I hear quite often is we have a workforce shortage. We also have a problem with our local governments being able to afford to having the funds to not only, so they have a workforce problem, not having the physical people to conduct something like a pop-up polling, but then also having the funds. So, Madam Speaker, if Representative Purcell would yield to another question.
She will yield.
What if simply, Representative Purcell, you are asking quite a bit of local governments, and you are us in the wisdom of St. Paul here. We think we know better than the local governments. They are hurting with their workforce. They are hurting financially. And quite simply, what do you say to those local governments that just say they cannot do this? They cannot provide the people, and they do not have the funds to do this?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. So in this conference committee report, we fund these one-day pop-up locations up to $5,000, and this is not mandatory. Right now, this is an opt-in provision, so the idea is that there would be some dialogue between the campus, between the election administration, in order to hopefully make this work and make voting more accessible.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Representative Purcell and Madam Speaker. And if Representative Purcell would yield to one more question.
She will yield.
Okay, and my last question is, you know, there are laws about when we have polling places that we cannot be campaigning within a certain area to where people are actually voting. And has Representative Purcell taken this to account, and how could they verify that campaigning or influencing votes is not happening on college campuses?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. I know the college polling location that happens on election day inside my district. They have the perimeter and the boundary just like all the other locations in my district and presumably all of our districts. And when we wrote this, we wanted to make sure, again, as I mentioned, that dialogue between the college and the election officials to find an appropriate place that would be suitable to follow all of those laws.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Purcell. Members, you know, this is a new area. I know even though they said that it's voluntary, this is not going to be something that is super easy. And I am very concerned about this, but I think more so, Minnesotans are concerned going back to how does this build confidence? It absolutely does not build confidence. How is this going to add to security? The answers that we heard were very vague, very gray, in just saying like, well, it's just going to happen. How is this actually going to happen, members? How are we going to make sure ballots being transferred back and forth from college campuses are secure? You can't just say something is going to magically happen and it's going to happen. Nothing about this bill is providing confidence or security in our elections. In fact, it is doing quite the opposite. This is providing a huge gray area where more and more people are going to be questioning the validity of our elections moving forward. And we'll give just one more reasons for Minnesotans to be upset and wondering what in the world is happening in Minnesota. Members, this was very disappointing to see that we had these common sense bills that the Republicans have offered in the elections committee. And as I mentioned, these are not Republican-only supported things. Voter ID, provisional ballots. These are common sense things that could easily add to our elections to make sure that our confidence level is going up, the security of our election is going up, and none of that happened. And that's what's very, very disappointing was to watch. So thank you again, Lead Carlson, for recommending to send this back to the conference committee, and I respect that decision. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Carver, Representative Nash.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do support the Torkelson motion to refuse to adopt. And a couple of things come to mind. You know, I served on the Elections Committee for a number of years, and that was during the time of the Dayton administration and Governor Walz, who even at the time said, I want a bipartisan elections bill. Who'd have thunk that we could get to the day where we didn't actually have that? And so a couple of amendments sprinkled in, doesn't really mean that it's bipartisan. And I think that we should be ashamed of a bill that doesn't have the voice of both sides in the election. Because I've even heard the Secretary of State himself say that bipartisan is a good, I can see Representative Freiberg right there. I'm looking through it's fine. We sat in committee together where the Secretary of State said that. We knew from governor's staff that they wanted a bipartisan bill. And we can go back for Representative Nelson was there, Representative O'Driscoll was there, a bunch of us were there, and we were told if it doesn't have agreement, it's not going to get a signature. And then, who knows what happened, but something happened, and we stopped caring about bipartisan election provisions, and that is shameful. And I don't know what to tell people in my district as to why we don't really seem to care about having good, solid elections administration policy put into the bill from both sides. That didn't happen. So, secondly, the committee vote taken on Friday of last week, I believe, was your vote to move it back out. Okay, Friday. The Senate had never seen the spending provision, had never voted on the spending provision. If I remember back to your conversation as we started this, I believe that was the case. So here we are, looking at spending that the Senate, apparently someone gave Representative Freiberg, he said earlier, permission to go ahead and put it in. It's okay, we're not gonna die on the hill of process. It's okay to skip process because really who's going to watch? Well, guess what? We are. And I think Minnesota is. I think that Minnesotans want to see that even though they know that we may lose, they want to know that you went through the process of being encumbered with taking the difficult time to put up a vote to engross something into the bill. Wow, that sounds hard. Think about that. You've merged spending into another bill that didn't get voted off the Senate floor. And I keep thinking back, maybe I'm just naive. Maybe I'm just a kid at heart that I remember, Schoolhouse Rocks. The bills have to be the same. You have to have the same thing voted in the same chamber. And if there's a disagreement, you take it to conference committee. Apparently, we're not living under the old rules. What a thought. So this past weekend, I was talking to some friends, and I brought up this very interesting provision, Representative Freiberg. It's on page 11, and a number of people have referenced it, but it starts on line 11.7 and goes all the way down to 11.14 and beyond, but it says, a paper application registration must provide a space for the voter to make a physical description of the location of their residence if voter resides in an area lacking specific physical address. The description must be sufficient for the county auditor to identify the correct precinct. Now, I'm going to offer you this, and I think a lot of you will know this. Let's say a motivational speaker moves to Carver County, and the motivational speaker's name happens to be Matt Foley, and Matt Foley decides that he wants to live in a van down by the river. Apparently, you can do that now. You can describe where that van down by the river is, and you can now be a voter in the state of Minnesota. And you don't even have to fall on a coffee table to break it up. All you got to do is give them a rough description. I, Matt Foley, live in a van down by the river. And we're done. Are we on Saturday Night Live? Is that what this bill is? Is this a Saturday Night Live bill? That's ridiculous. Why are we putting into law that a person with really no fixed geographical address, other than they live in a van down by the river, can become a voter and can change the way things happen here? I'll pick on her. She's standing right over there. Representative Franzen, her first election, how many votes? 1 vote. 2, okay, 2. Sorry. You can win by a margin of 1 vote, and Matt Foley, living in a van down by the river, can be the person casting the deciding vote if this becomes law. I couldn't even keep a straight face as I'm telling my friends this. You're going to vote to put Matt Foley in a van down by the river as a registered voter? Members, if for no other reason that we don't want motivational speakers living in a van down by the river in the state of Minnesota, you should vote to send this back. Refuse to adopt, because that is the most ridiculous piece of legislation I have ever seen in my life. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I've always, as I go around and talk to my various constituents throughout my district, the discussion about elections comes up, election integrity in particular. And a lot of people come up to me and say, why should I even vote? I don't think my vote's going to count. Or if it does, somebody else's illegal vote is going to null and void my vote. So members, I have a strong thought that I believe we should have election accessibility, as I know my friends on the other side of the aisle desire, and I do too, but it should be balanced with election security. Because right or wrong, if the perception is there that one's vote doesn't count, it starts creating anger, it starts creating division, and it causes people not to vote. There are thousands of people in my own district that don't vote, and many of them are not voting because they don't think that their vote counts. Well, I happen to believe that everyone should come away from an election knowing that it's fair and secure and that their vote counts. So I support sending this conference committee report back to the conference committee, because this bill does nothing to secure our elections. As Representative Nash mentioned, now somebody can vote and not even have an address. What kind of a secure feeling does that give people as they're going to vote? So over the last decade, I've heard Democrats complain that there's election fraud, and I've heard Republicans complain that there's election fraud. I've heard independents complain that there is election fraud. And we know from many different polls that much of the state believes there is election fraud. There's a lot of insecurity in regards to elections, and that shouldn't be. Because if we want elections accessible, what good does that do if they're accessible and people don't vote because they don't believe it's going to count anyway? It loses its purpose. We want people to vote, every legal resident of this state, and therefore we need to make sure that we have secure elections. So I look at election integrity like a bucket of water. And every time something happens that causes people to feel like their vote doesn't count or a fraudulent vote will be put into motion, it just drives a hole in that bucket. And it starts leaking, and then it starts leaking again when you have another one. I would vote no on this, or I think it should be sent back to get fixed just because of this address issue. My goodness, people should have to have an address to put down. I know there are people who don't have an address. We'll figure out how we can get them one where they can go in and find out who they are and put their name down and give them an address that counts. Figure out how to do it that way, but don't just say they can just write the vicinity of where they're living. That doesn't help anything. So this report does nothing to shore up election security and integrity. It spends money that we don't have. We're looking at a budget deficit next year, and it takes right out of that and adds more to the deficit. And it actually makes fraud more likely to happen. So, members, please support the motion to send this back to conference committee. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Chisago, Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. You know, at the beginning, after elections, we sort of fill out a form that says what committees we want to serve on. And for the first time this year, on my committee selection form, I said, not elections. I'm done serving on elections. Oh, I'm breaking Emma's heart. But it's still in my blood. I can't totally let it go. As much as I felt like I had done my time, I can't let it go. Now, during this discussion, I've gotten part way through the bill, maybe a third of the way through the bill, and boy, there are some doozies. I have not gotten all the way through yet, but I want to highlight a couple of things that I think are problematic and a good reason to support Representative Torkelson's motion to refuse to adopt the report. And I would start with just the appointments to fill vacancies, special elections. Here's the problem with this kind of language that allows a vacancy to be filled by appointment instead of special election. And this vacancy is for 2 years. That's a long time. For us as legislators, that's a full term. 2 years is a full term for us. And when we are appointing to fill a vacancy instead of holding a special election, we are literally taking a vote away from the citizens. This is literally anti-democracy, to fill a vacancy by other elected officials rather than putting it to a vote of the people. It is literally anti-democracy. And it's wrong. And you know, here's the deal. Some school board positions are at large. My local school board is at large. So everyone is elected by the entire electorate. It could be argued in those situations that appointments are less egregious. However, when these positions are elected by ward or by subdivision, that's like saying if Representative Freiberg resigned from the legislature today, the rest of us should get to decide who fills his seat. That's absurd. The people of his district should fill his seat. We shouldn't get to pick who's going to fill his seat in the legislature. And 2 years, that's a full legislative term. That's a long time. This is also ripe for shenanigans. Let's say you've got a school board. Let's say you've got a 5-member school board. And you have 2 members of that school board who have a strong feeling about an issue. And one of the members who disagrees resigns. So you've got an open position. And now these 2 members who care a lot about this issue, they maneuver to appoint their person to fill that vacancy. And now, voila, they've created a majority on the school board with no vote from the public. It's just absolutely wrong and bad policy and anti-democracy. Let's go on to the next item. Registering to vote with no address. I am not gonna lie, this one actually made me giggle. It actually made me laugh out loud back here. I know it's shocking that I would laugh out loud, but this one actually made me laugh out loud. The paper application must provide a space for a voter to provide a physical description. A space for the voter to provide a physical description. I quickly made up a physical description of my voting, my address. I have trees. I have sort of a wooded yard with a pond. And that's my physical description of where I live. And now, interestingly, this is what the language says. The description may The description may, if you want to, you can include closest cross streets, the nearest address, a location that's identified on a precinct map. If you want to, you can choose to do that. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. You can just give us a description. And it actually does not say a written description. You don't have to write out words to physically describe this. I think the picture I drew of my address would suffice. I think this would work under this language. Like, come on, guys, this is clown world. This is like, I don't know if you Democrats know, but if you talk to anyone, Republican or Democrat, anywhere across this country, their jaws drop when we talk about how we run elections in the state of Minnesota. And this is absolutely comical in how absurd it is. I do just want to clarify too, we were told a minute ago this temporary location on college campuses, it's just opt-in. Well, it's opt-in for the college. It's not opt-in for the county. The county must comply. The county must put forward the staff, resources, equipment, etc., to provide these pop-up temporary locations. So let's not be confused about opt-in, opt-out. It's not opt-in for everybody. This is compelled. And interestingly, it is compelled for the counties, but counties are only going to be reimbursed if the DFLers actually provided enough money for that. If they didn't, well, then it's going to be pared down to whatever they can afford. That's what they're actually going to get. So counties are not necessarily even going to be reimbursed for this appropriately. It's not opt-in for them. They must do it. Let's jump ahead. Representative Niska was touching on some language that I thought was pretty interesting. It's always interesting when in the side-by-sides going into conference, there is identical or almost identical language, and somehow that language gets jettisoned in the conference report. So Representative Niska touched on this. There was an exception in both the House and the Senate bill. There were exceptions for these subject matter experts when it comes to registering for lobbying. Almost identical language in the House and Senate, but somehow that language was jettisoned in the conference report. Again, that is pretty comical in and of itself. But I want to talk for a second about the study that was included, because Representative Freiberg said a minute ago that, well, we want to wait for the results of the study before we take any action. But that's not totally true, because you still provide some exceptions in the language, and other folks, you are requiring implementation right now before the study is completed. Would Representative Freiberg yield to a question?
He will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Representative Freiberg, for yielding. So, you said a minute ago that we want to wait for the results of the study before we implement. However, it looks like in the bill language that if you are an individual attempting to influence an official action in a political subdivision in a non-metropolitan unit of government, then you actually are exempted from registering. But if you are attempting to do so in a metropolitan unit of government, then you do have to register now if you meet these thresholds, even though the study is not completed. Am I reading that correctly?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative New Brindley. You might want to ask Representative Coulter if he is on the floor. This was his provision. I am glad to have the opportunity to respond to this because I know Representative Niska, as you pointed out, raised this earlier. This bill doesn't in any way prevent subject matter experts from speaking to us. It just says if they're being paid enough and directly influencing us, they should register as a lobbyist. It's what the law currently says. It's not that hard to do and it's not that complicated. It's good for transparency, and it's good for the public to know who is attempting to influence elected officials. And I'm kind of surprised the opposite is being suggested. And it's actually a pretty large number of hours that triggers the registration requirement. Just wanted to mention that point. Thank you.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, that's also an interesting point. It's a relatively large number of hours, but this goes back to somebody, I don't remember who talked about a CEO loophole. It's a relatively large number of hours. Well, it's a relatively large number of hours for some people, but it's a relatively few number of hours for other people. Basically, what this means is if you are a lower wage worker, you get more hours of free speech than if you are a more highly paid worker. You get fewer hours of free speech under this language because the threshold is $3,000. But if you get paid more at an hourly rate, you get far fewer hours of free speech than if you are a lower wage worker, which some are more equal than others, I suppose. I suppose, Madam Speaker, would Representative Coulter yield for that same question?
He will yield. Representative New Brindley.
Does Representative Coulter need me to? Excellent. I will restate the question. So, and maybe there's some confusion because Representative Freiberg is actually the one who a few moments ago said that we want to wait for the results of the study before we implement. However, the reality is that some folks are required to comply with implementation now prior to the study being completed. So in the language, if you are attempting to influence the official action of a political subdivision that is not a metropolitan unit of government, well, then you don't have to register. But if you are trying to influence a metropolitan unit of government, then you do have to register prior to the completion of the study. Am I understanding that correctly?
Representative Coulter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative New Brindley. I would say yes, you are understanding that language correctly. I would also point out that before any changes that were made in the elections bill last year, that was current law. Folks who were attempting to influence an official action of what is defined as a metropolitan governmental unit, I believe, were under previous law should have been required to register as lobbyists.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And would Representative Coulter continue to yield?
He will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So you say that was current law, people who are trying to influence an election. However, that really is not clearly defined here, is it? Let me give you an example. So prior to serving in the legislature, I served on my local planning commission. We had an issue come about regarding heavy manufacturing and where we wanted to zone. And I reached out on my social media and said, hey, do I know any environmental engineers? And sure enough, a friend responded, yep, my husband is actually an environmental engineer. So I reached out and I had conversations with him. Now, as I read this language, he would be a subject matter expert, and yet I'm the one who reached out to him. Now, I do that here at the legislature too, right? There's lots of lobbyists I reach out to for expertise on different issues, but he was not registered as a lobbyist. If I spent enough time talking to him, would he have to register as a lobbyist?
Representative Coulter.
If I'm, thank you, Madam Speaker, thank you, Representative Brindley. If I'm understanding your question correctly, in this particular instance, you mentioned that you were a member of your local planning commission, which if I remember the speaker, every time the speaker calls on you, you live in Chisago County, which would not have been, which would not be part of the 7-county metro area, so that would not have applied to your specific circumstance, no.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Coulter continue to yield?
He will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Coulter, let's say I lived in Plymouth. Then would this person have to register?
Representative Coulter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Representative Brindley. Again, this is based on, when we're talking about individuals, it's the amount of time that they spend in this particular action is sort of factored against their individual salary, how much they make. And so in this particular instance, for example, if this engineer made, say, $100,000 a year, they would have to be in these kinds of conversations with you as in, or would have been in your role as a planning commissioner for, I believe, something like 60 hours. So if those conversations then, if in totaled more than 60 hours, then, I mean, in that particular instance, if you'd been on, say, a planning commission in the metropolitan area, then in that instance, that individual would have, under previous and current law, been required to register as a lobbyist.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what we just heard is, yes, if I live in the metro area, they do have to register, but no, if I live where I live right now in Chisago County, they do not have to register. Madam Speaker, would Representative Coulter yield for another question?
He will yield.
Thank you. Representative Coulter, is this based on where I live in Chisago County, or is this based on where this environmental engineer lives in Plymouth?
Representative Coulter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In this particular metaphor, Representative Brindley, since you would be the public official, it would be based on where you live.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So okay, this is very interesting. So it's based on where I live. There's a big carve out here for non-metro units of government. Big carve out. Again, we're going to continue implementation for metro units of government, but we are going to stall implementation for non-metro units of government for the time being until the study is completed. Big carve out, let's think about Mayo Clinic. It's one of our few, well, it's one of our, is it the biggest employer in the state or one of the biggest employers in the state? It's right up there at the top. And I think it might be the biggest. It is the biggest, that's what I'm hearing. It's the largest, I'm getting confirmation. Largest employer in the entire state is exempted out of this. The CEO of Mayo can spend all the time they want talking to their local unit of government. But my local, you name it, environmental engineer, physician, could be anything, they're going to be limited on how much they get to talk to their local units of government. And again, that only applies to the metro. So actually, mine get to do all they want. But Representative Whitty, yours are limited. Yours don't get to talk. They are limited in speech. Mine get to have all the free speech they want, but yours get limited free speech. Would Representative Coulter yield for another question?
He will yield. Representative Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm wondering, Representative Coulter, if you can talk to me a little bit about, let's see here, lines, on page 83, lines 30 through 32. You say a lobbyist principal that is represented by a lobbyist who attempts to influence the official action of a metropolitan governmental unit must comply with the reporting requirement in Minnesota statutes. I am wondering how that interacts. So we're talking about a lobbyist principal. I'm wondering how this interacts with the existing statute that's actually in this bill. It happens to be in this bill, the existing statute. It's on page 68 in the bill, that a lobbyist does not include a public official. But what if the public official works for a lobbyist principal? How do we deal with that situation?
Representative Coulter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Brindley. The actions that, if for example, a local public official also has a job as a lobbyist, the actions that would require them to register and report and do all of those things are the actions that they take, that they receive compensation for as a lobbyist. Any compensation or any actions that they take in their roles as public officials would not qualify under the situation that you're referring to.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Coulter continue to yield?
He will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm wondering, there's some confusion about what a lobbyist principal is versus what a lobbyist is. And I'm talking about a public official who works for a lobbyist principal. How do we deal with that?
Representative Coulter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess maybe I'm just not understanding the nature of your question, Representative New Brindley, because a public official, their role as a public official would be separate from their role as a lobbyist.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now we're getting somewhere, aren't we? That's sort of the crux of the issue here, isn't it? Because if you work for a lobbyist principal, is your role separate? Is it separate? Do you not engage in your role as a public official with the lens of the lobbyist principal that you work for and advocate for in normal life? That seems unclear and like perhaps something we should get figured out. Seems like something we should get figured out. At the very least, in this bill, free speech is more equal for some than others. At the very least. You talk about the CEO loophole. You know what? We've got a lot of CEOs that are well compensated in this state. It's not going to take them very long to hit the $3,000 threshold. So those CEOs get just a little bit of free speech. Interestingly, even if it's the legislator or public official who's reaching out to them, this does not even mean that the CEO is reaching out to the public official. If we are reaching out to the CEOs, we're going to force them into a situation where they have to register as a lobbyist. They're not even trying. I mean, do you understand what this means? You are going to cut off access to public officials to subject matter experts. We have unbelievable subject matter experts in this state, and you are literally going to cut off our access to subject matter experts because you want to make them register as lobbyists, even if we're the ones reaching out to them. That's the most absurd thing. And again, they're going to hit that $3,000 threshold much more quickly than someone working a lower wage job. So free speech for thee, but not for you. This is unequal and unfair. I cannot imagine that this will stand up to judicial scrutiny. I cannot imagine that it would stand up to judicial scrutiny. There are all kinds of reasons. I'll spend some time after I get done. I'll spend some time making it through the rest of the bill. I'm sure I'll find some more doozies. But I think for now, this is certainly more than enough to say, no, this bill is not ready for prime time. Let's vote yes on the motion to refuse to adopt and send this back and actually get some serious work done. Thank you, members.
I recognize the member from Scott, Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Thank you, Representative New Brindley, for a good discussion. And this idea of subject matter experts is something that's really interesting to me, because I think as I've learned this whole legislative role, one of the things that I've really had to rely on are those subject matter experts. Some of them are sitting in this chamber right now, but some of them are registered lobbyists, and some of them are just normal people that come and schedule a meeting and want to sit down and advocate for whatever they're passionate about. And I think Representative New Brindley's point is well taken. Like, where do they cross that line and that threshold? So, but this really struck a chord for me, not here in St. Paul, but actually in Shakopee when I was at church. And I was listening to the message, and my pastor actually talked that he may fall under now as a lobbyist. He literally just heard that from another member of our church community. And he was perplexed about that, because he's just advocating for his worldview, his beliefs. So I wonder if Representative Freiberg would yield for a question.
He will yield.
Representative Freiberg, so in a hypothetical situation where my pastor is coming and advocating for something that fits his perspective, his worldview, because we're debating topics a lot, religious liberty, for example, would that fall under this? And would, if he reached a certain threshold when he's advocating from his pastoral capacity, could he have to register as a lobbyist?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Bakeberg, for the question. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just scrolling through the definition of lobbyist. There are quite a few exemptions to that definition. I've never, and the only thing we add in, we don't actually add anything into the definition of lobbyist. I've never heard of a pastor having to register as a lobbyist, so my assumption is the answer would be no.
Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Representative Freiberg. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that's something that we need clarity on. And we need to make sure that when we're passing legislation, we need to make it clear to all members of our community what this legislation actually does. And we've heard a couple instances of some inconsistencies. One of the things I've appreciated the most here is meeting just amazing people from across the state. Some of the amazing people that I've really appreciated, they're part of the Church Ambassador Network, where they, on a bipartisan basis, go in and address the spiritual needs of members during heavy times. That's fantastic, and it's bipartisan. Many of those individuals are full-time pastors that come and volunteer. So based off of what Representative Freiberg just said, there's some uncertainty of, is that lobbying? I think we need to have that clarified. A religious leader coming and advocating for their worldview, and if they're up here, meet that certain threshold, they could fall under and have to register as a lobbyist. Different religious leaders from across the political perspective, they are subject matter experts. We have them come in and testify a lot. We should be having subject matter experts from across the perspective of our communities, to be able to talk about the bills so that we can learn and we can have different perspectives on things, because from my lens, I am going to miss things. Every single one of us, we do not know and understand everything. We have to have people from the community to come in and help educate us. And I think that goes into what Representative Torkelson talked about at the beginning of just the goals of the Elections Committee to be bipartisan. To say that a few amendments that were taken late makes this a bipartisan bill is a farce. And we've talked extensively about that. No GOP members on the conference committee. That's not bipartisan. And maybe if we had some bipartisan work, we wouldn't be having this long debate right now, and we would have answers to the questions we were asking. Election security. We heard a lot of discussion about that. I don't think there's a person in this chamber that doesn't agree that we need to have safe and secure elections. It's just how we get there is a little bit different perspective. But saying that a physical description of where you live, you know, I live down by this street, that's not safe and secure, and it certainly doesn't increase the confidence in elections. So I would support Representative Torkelson's motion to refuse adoption, because there's obviously a number of issues that need to be addressed with this bill. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move to table the refusal to adopt.
Representative Long moves to table. Representative Long moves to table the Conference Committee report on House File number 4772. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The bill's on the table. Messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate. Madam Speaker, I hereby announce the Senate refuses to concur in the House amendments to the following Senate file. Senate file number 4699, an act relating to state government. The Senate has respectfully requested that a conference committee be appointed therein. The Senate has appointed as such members of the committee, Senators Wicklund, Mann, and Kupek. The message is signed Thomas S. Boddern, Secretary of the Senate. Liebling moves that the House accede to the request of the Senate that the Speaker appoint a conference committee of 3 members of the House to meet with a like committee appointed by the Senate on the disagreeing votes.
Representative Long.
That is our motion.
All those in favor of the Liebling motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails.
Message from the Senate. Madam Speaker, I hereby announce the Senate refuses to concur in the House amendments to the following Senate file. Senate file number 4942, an act relating to state government, authorizing supplemental agricultural appropriations. The Senate respectfully requests that a conference committee be appointed therein. The Senate has appointed as such committees Senators Frentz, Klein, Putnam, Zhang, and Dames. The message is signed Thomas S. Boddern, Secretary of the Senate. Aiken moves that the House accede to the request of the Senate and that the Speaker appoint a conference committee of 5 members of the House to meet with a like committee appointed by the Senate.
Representative Aiken.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That is my motion.
All those in favor of the Aiken motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day will be reported by the Chief Clerk.
Senate file number 37, an act relating to state government, proposing an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution, Article 1, by adding a section provided for equality under the law, the unofficial engrossment.
Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that Senate file number 37 be laid on the table.
Representative Long moves that Senate file 37 be laid on the table. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The bill is laid on the table. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 3276. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 3276, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to elections, providing for ranked choice voting, the second engrossment.
Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that House File 3276 be laid on the table.
Representative Long moves that House File 3276 be laid on the table. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The bill is laid on the table. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 4657. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 4657, number 3 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to public safety, the first engrossment. I'm just giving you these for now.
Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that House File 4657 be laid on the table.
Representative Long moves that House File 4657 be laid on the table. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The bill's on the table. Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there's no objection, we'll take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail. Announcements by the Speaker.
The Speaker announces the appointment of the following members of the House to a conference committee on House File number 2609. Berg, Moeller, and Whitty. Announcement by the Speaker. The Speaker announces the appointment of the following members of the House to a conference committee on Senate File number 4699. Liebling, Pinto, and Bierman.
Announcement by the Speaker.
Announcement by the Speaker. The Speaker announces the appointment of the following members of the House to a conference committee on Senate File number 4942. Acom, Stevenson, Vang, Purcell, and Kraft.
Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 11 a.m. on Wednesday, May 15th, 2024.
Representative Long moves that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 11 a.m. Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Elections Conference report be taken from the table.
Representative Long moves that the Elections Conference Committee be taken from the table. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The bill is before us. We were on the motion to refuse to concur, and my understanding that refuse to adopt. My understanding is that Representative Torkelson is the last speaker, and that Representative Freiberg is the second to the last speaker. Have all those been called on who seek to be recognized? The member from Wright, Representative Rarick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, I was supposed to be on the list. So I have some concerns about this, and we've talked about this for 2 years straight, and I thought we were finally getting things on a better track, but we are not. So in this bill, there is a House File 3447, which is the portion on the bill that starts on page 18, and it's at 18.10, and it goes to the next page, and it goes through 19.6. And I'm going to give Representative Freiberg just a minute to get to that page, page 18. Again, it starts in 18.8. And this was House File 3447. So Representative Freiberg, House File 3447, did it go to the Higher Ed Committee? If he would yield, Madam Speaker. He will yield. Representative Freiberg. Representative Freiberg, did you need her to ask the question again? He will yield.
Sorry, correct. I did ask the higher ed chair if he wanted to see this bill, and he said he had no need to.
Representative Rarick. Well, it did go to the Higher Ed Committee in the Senate. Representative Freiberg, will you yield to another question? He will yield. Representative Rarick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Freiberg, did this bill go to the State and Local Government Committee?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Rarick. No, it did not.
Representative Rarick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So it did in the Senate. Again, dun, dun, dun. This is repeated over and over and over and over again. Once again, we have a bill that didn't go to two committees that it should have gone to. And why is that? Why should it have gone to higher ed? Oh, I don't know, because it has to do with higher ed. Quite a bit about higher ed. The other thing, if Representative Freiberg would continue to yield, because I'm really confused about the conference committee report. Just ask him to yield each time you have a question, and I will ask whether he will yield. So you would like him to yield? There Yes. isn't such a thing as continue to yield. He will yield. Representative Rarick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for asking him to continue to yield. It is very late. It's almost 11 o'clock at night. We've been at this since 11 this morning. We are all very, very tired and would like to go home. Representative Freiberg. Representative Freiberg, I see many lines that are in the conference committee report that are not in the House file and they're not in the Senate file. You can find them on line 18.22, 18.23. It continues on to 18.24, continue down to 18.27, 18.28, 18.29. There's another line in 18.31 and 32, and the entire next paragraph. We're not in either House or Senate bill. Representative Freiberg, where did that language come from? Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Rarick. This language came as a result of Representative Purcell's very hard work getting language that was amenable to stakeholders, the Senate and the House. It's certainly nothing new for language to get refined during the conference committee, and Representative Purcell did a great job refining this language.
Representative Rarick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Refining language. Okay. So, see, if we'd actually gone to higher ed committee, if we'd actually gone to the state and local government committee, we maybe had discovered some of these things that we're missing. These are pretty significant things that we're missing. This is a little more than refinement. For these reasons alone, it should go back. I wish it could go all the way back to the higher ed committee and all the way back to the state government committee. Of course, we're not going to do that, but here we go again, members and the public. No one's listening at 11 o'clock at night, but if you are, here we are again, a bill that skipped committees in the House. They actually went to committees in the Senate, I'll give them that. But again, we're skipping two of the major committees in the House. Again, that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years. We're rushing things through, and so then we have to fix them in conference committee. And they've come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines that are completely new language, was not vetted in any of those committees that we were just talking about. And I have to point out that, the bill that we started with, the House File 3447, is barely a 2-page bill. And the new language is just a few lines. So we went from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.5 lines to more than double that, and most of that is brand new language. Not well vetted. This is not well thought out. Once again, we're skipping committees once again, and this is on top of everything else we've just talked to for the last 2 hours or more. So I would urge you to please refuse to adopt this conference committee report.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And members, I support the Torkelson motion to send this back. It's funny, when we first considered this bill,
I wrote about it in my newsletter, and my constituents were flabbergasted at the thought that we would not, that we would allow people to just describe their residence as part of the voter registration process. And so I had hoped that that would come out in the conference committee. But if any of my constituents are watching, I have bad news for you. It's still in there. And if for people who want to follow along, it's in section, on page 11, sections 11.7 through 11.14. And some people really don't believe me, so I have to say, oh, sorry, that was a different, let me get the right thing. I have so many tabs in here. Yes, that is right, 11.7 to 11.14. The paper registration must provide a space for the voter to provide a physical description of the location of their residence if the voter resides in an area lacking specific physical address. The description must be sufficient for the county auditor to identify the correct precinct for the voter. It may include the closest cross street or nearest address to the described location, and directions from the cross street or address to the described location, including but not limited to the cardinal directions, so just north, south, east, or west, and the approximate distance from the location. Members, we are allowing people to register to vote by just describing on a piece of paper roughly where they live. And what's most interesting about that, and I think will be very galling for our constituents, is that that's so you can register to vote and cast your vote. But if you happen to be someone who's there covering the election and wanting to do election exit polling, then on page 29, you have to provide photo identification to the head judge and a letter of credential from a credentialed news media. So we are letting people just sort of describe vaguely where they live, but yet we're requiring photo ID for people who are covering the election. It's, as someone else said, it's like a Saturday Night Live skit. But another place of concern that I have on this, members, is something that Representative Niska referred to a while back on the new Minnesota sort of Voting Rights Act information. And this is a very substantial change in law, and it's very concerning, some of the factors. If you read through pages 57 through 59, it talks about the different factors that are used for determining if someone is indeed violating this new State Voting Rights Act. And there are many factors that are established to determine if a violation has occurred. And a lot of it has to do with the history of discrimination, the extent to which members of the class are disadvantaged, including education and employment. And I wondered, you know, right now 50% of our students can't read or do math at grade level. So clearly education is a problem, and would that be considered a factor under this test? The numbers are much higher for the protected classes. So I don't know what the remedy would be on the state if we're the ones who have failed to provide proper education, but that's certainly a concern. Another factor that the courts can consider is the extent of polarized voting. I'm not sure what that means or what level of jurisdiction is being considered there, but that seems a little bit concerning. And then the other one that I thought was interesting is a factor that can be considered is the lack of responsiveness by elected officials to the particular needs of a protected class members or a community of protected class members. But there's no standard for determining what lack of responsiveness means. Again, it's very vague, but what's most interesting, members, is that there's all these 12 factors that could be considered by the courts. But then right under that, it says the necessity of the factors. And it says the court shall consider a particular factor if and only if, and to the extent evidence pertaining to that factor is introduced. But the absence of evidence of any of those factors does not preclude the finding of a violation of the law. So we don't actually need evidence of these factors to find a violation. And then a little further down, we also don't need any evidence of intent. It says evidence concerning the intent of voters, elected officials, or the political subdivision to discriminate is not required to find a violation of this new Voting Rights Act. Members, what are we doing? This is so problematic. This needs to go back. And then another thing that's interesting is so the courts can consider these 12 factors, but then they don't need to find any of them, and they don't need to have evidence of intent. But then there are specific things the court must exclude. And one of the things the court absolutely cannot consider in finding a violation is the number of protected class members who have not been burdened by the challenged qualification, prerequisite, standard, practice, or procedure. So even if it hasn't been a problem for other people of the same protected class, if it is for one, it could still be a violation. So that's a concern. And then another one is that the court is absolutely not allowed to consider the potential of criminal activity by individual voters or the connection to criminal activity, or if it's been not occurred in the political subdivision. That's also a concern. So we're very prescriptive on what the court cannot consider, really broad on what the court can consider, and in the end, we don't need any evidence of intent or evidence of these factors at all. This is a very concerning provision of this statute. And then I'd like to just end by talking about what Representative New Brindley was talking about whether we can, if we're going to now be limited by who we can reach out to for expert advice. I'm someone who likes to get a broad array of input and talk to a lot of people. I actually honestly like to talk to people who aren't necessarily engaged here at the Capitol, or I like just to get sort of people from the real world who have a lot of experience in things that I don't have a lot of experience in. And some of my go-to people are people that I've known in other stages of life. My office mate when I was in graduate school is now a PhD economist, health economist at a very large university on the East Coast. And occasionally I'll give him a ring and I'll say, hey, Chris, what do you think of this? What's been your experience? What does the research say? I have some other economist friends in other parts of the country that I'll call and say, what's the latest research in this or that? And it would be, to me, very personally concerning that I would not be able to reach out to people that I've known in other stages of life for their advice or expertise on matters that we're considering. But what's interesting is so those people might now have to register as a lobbyist, which is crazy to me. But who is not a lobbyist anymore, in the new language of the statute, the only new thing added, who is no longer going to be considered a lobbyist? An individual providing information or advice to members of a collective bargaining unit when the unit is actively engaged in collective bargaining processes with a state agency or political subdivision. So if someone is actively giving advice or information to members of a collective bargaining unit, suddenly they're not considered a lobbyist. What? So members, this bill, I mean, I have a lot of tabs here, I will spare you, but this bill has a ton of problems and it absolutely should go back. And to Representative Nash and other members' points, is very disconcerting for the institution of the Minnesota legislature that we have taken in this session and last session steps to have such partisan election bills. That was never the tradition of this body in prior administrations, in prior legislative sessions. I worked here 30 years ago during Governor Carlson's administration, and that was
true for Governor Carlson, it was true for Governor Pawlenty, it was true for Governor Dayton, and it should be true of us. And I am very disappointed that this legislature is going down a path of such partisan, one-sided election bills, and it does not serve the state of Minnesota well.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I want to pick up kind of, well, first let me just make a general statement here. This bill makes it easier to vote, easier to cheat, and easier to sue. Representative New Brindley, you know, I'm going to steal your word here. You haven't said it for a long time. It's bonkers. It's bonkers that someone only has to give a physical description of where they live to register to vote. Maybe it's this big parking lot, and there are a lot of buses coming and going from Chicago, to and from Chicago. But yeah, that's where I live. Yep, that's where I live. It's bonkers. It's absolutely insane. And I like you, Representative New Brindley. I can't read that from here. Oh, it's a picture of where you live. Trees, pond, house. I talk to other people from other states. I'm from Iowa originally, and I tell them about this vouching system that we have in Minnesota, and they think that's crazy. But this is a whole new level. It's a whole new level. It's bonkers. And then we get to the part where on redistricting, we have to in order to do the redistricting, we use an incarcerated person's last known address. Well, I know we aren't keeping people in prison very long here anymore in the state of Minnesota. I get that. But really, somebody's been in prison for 10, 15 years and we're going to use the address that they were last lived in? Somebody else is living there now. I just don't think the people of Minnesota are going to believe this. It's almost unbelievable what's happening in this bill. I don't really think there are words to explain the level of cheating that can go on. Cheating and inaccuracies that will just run through our election system. I can't wait to do my weekly update for this week. I can't wait to send that out. I'm going to put this all over social media. I mean, people are going to have to know about this. People in Minnesota are not going to be happy about this. Either side of the aisle shouldn't be happy about this. It's a disgrace. It really is a disgrace. Please vote for the Torkelson motion. Send this back. Let's rip some of this stuff out of this bill so it's not an embarrassment to our entire state. The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, members, Representative Scott is correct. The only way to describe this bill is bonkers. I've seen some strange things over my years, but this is the absolutely most insane election bill I've ever seen. I'm wondering if Representative Freiberg would yield for a question.
He will yield. Representative Johnson.
Members, Representative Freiberg, I also begin looking at line 11.8 with the description of where you live. Now in Minnesota, we have what's called same-day registration, so you can get register the day you vote. You get a ballot, you put it in the tally machine, because we don't have provisional ballots.
the only state that has same-day registration but not have provisional ballots. And there is some lawsuits going on. Hopefully, it's been going on for many years. Hopefully a judge will actually hear that one of these years. But Representative Freiberg, one thing they do when they fill out that registration is they mail a verification to the address. Now, Representative Freiberg, can you tell me what the verification process is going to be for somebody that just give a description that they live 200 feet from the rock that's in the fork in the road in a parking lot? Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Johnson, for the question. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because I was going to talk about this during my remarks before we conclude this motion, but I think maybe I'll just cover it here and then I won't need to speak again. I find it really odd that the provision allowing unhoused or homeless people to provide a description of where they live is being targeted. Lead Torkelson helped draft this provision. And a person without a house has as much a right to vote as anybody, despite specious and frankly offensive comparisons to Saturday Night Live. I mean, is the goal to completely disenfranchise homeless people? Is the goal to disenfranchise homeless veterans? There's many veterans who are homeless, and from what you're saying, oh, they're just comparable to the people who live in a van down by the river. I find that offensive. We should make it so that they can vote like everyone else. Beyond that, allowing a person to register at the physical location where they reside is federal law. It's allowed on the federal form. The language the minority has been citing is very similar to language that's in federal law. We're just adding it to Minnesota's form like many other states do. This is a common sense provision. This is a humane provision. This protects our homeless veterans, and we should support this provision.
Representative Johnson. Madam Speaker, members, Representative Freiberg, that may be true. It might be on the other forms. But there's one huge difference. We don't have the provisional ballots to verify where they live. They are commingled with the other ballots, and it cannot be taken out, so it's automatically counted. With this in this bill, without the provisional ballots, this is set up for huge election fraud. There's no way around it. It's absolutely bonkers. If you want to put this in there, that's fine, but get the provisional ballot. It is needed. Until that's in, let's send this conference committee report back to conference committee to get the provisional ballot fixed once and for all. Vote to not approve this conference report. The member from Morrison, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Purcell yield?
She will yield. Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Purcell, I have become extremely interested in these provisions, my understanding that you authored related to colleges and universities allowing for early voting. First, are there other states that already do this?
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Schultz. I guess I'm not sure about that. I would assume so, but I guess I'll say I don't know.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I find it very interesting, and I want this body to consider the route that we're taking overall and generally by allowing for early voting locations to be placed in specific locations across our state. Let me just ask this question. Where does it end? Where does it end? Because we certainly know how the people at a college and university where they have more than 100 people on campus, we generally know how they vote. We could use a college or university within the city of Northfield, and we could try to identify exactly who the people are on campus, the 5 people who vote Republican in the city of Northfield.
in the one precinct where there's a certain college and university. We could literally identify them all. So the question for this body is, if we are going to move forward with the proposal and an entire idea that allows for early voting on college campuses and universities generally, writ large, what's to say that in the next or in future bienniums, that bills won't be brought forward to put early voting sites in places of worship? Or that we're not going to have bills that come before this body to place early voting sites inside bars and restaurants? Very sincerely, a lot of concern has been shared about this general idea. And if this hasn't been done in another state, what are we doing here? Because this is a slippery slope. And I can promise you that if we head down this path, that is the next step, whether you like it or not. The general direction over allowing for early voting to take place on college campuses and universities, where, by the way, only college and campuses and universities where there is student housing of more than 100 students. So let's just play this out a little bit. There might be some state colleges and universities, most specifically state colleges or two-year colleges, vocational colleges in rural parts of the state where they don't have that sort of housing. This bill literally says they can't do this. That's the result of this bill. Literally says, unless you vote for Democrats 90% of the time, you cannot early vote on college campuses and universities. That is the result of this policy, this slippery slope, this standard that you are setting. And I promise you that if you happen to go to school in Northfield, it's not all that difficult to make it to a different early voting site where the rest of the general public also vote. You can walk there. You can bike there. You can get there. There's no issue with it. But instead, we have a bill before us that's all about making it as easy as possible for Democratic constituencies to vote. And I just think it's plain wrong. The member from Lyon, Representative Swedzinski.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to piggyback on Representative Brian Johnson's comments, really, kind of from a foundational standpoint, talking about the provisional balloting. Because this bill has kind of really opened our voting system up so wide, by not having the provisions of provisional balloting and keeping those ballots separate, really puts voters that have good ballots, that haven't maybe been proven to where their addresses have been proven, really puts those voters at a disadvantage because we don't have those folks set aside. They're just commingled with the rest of them. And if there is a problem, well, we're just going to pluck one out of there and pick it out and say, well, we hope that that's maybe represented the vote that maybe was illegitimate, maybe not. When we have House races, just as a few years ago, that were won by one vote here in the state legislature. And because of some bad voting, the wrong ballots in the wrong place, they happened to get lucky when those were drawn out. That increased up to 11. I'm not going to name names of who that might be, but by the luck of the poll, those elections are being decided. Representative Johnson's point of provisional balloting is so important, and it really is a disservice to voters across this state. And to Representative Schultz's point, I have
in my district 3 college campuses. I have one in Canby, one in Granite Falls, one in Marshall. There's probably not a lot of members that have 3 college campuses in the district, but I do. And really, this is a story of the haves and have-nots in this election bill. If you happen to be a welder or a student that's going to be working on wind turbines or a dental hygienist, this bill says you're not good enough to vote early. But if you happen to have some dormitories and you happen to have more of a liberal arts degree outlay, bring on those votes. Come on down. Folks, we can do better. Let's send this back to conference. Let's make this bill better. You know, Representative Freiberg brought up the idea of, you know, making fun of folks that would be living down by the river in a van, and how that was really discriminatory on how someone was making fun of that. And I think a fear of this is really, we saw this in the news not that long ago, talking about ballot harvesting. People in vans harvesting votes, and literally, by you allowing folks to say, you know what, that street corner over there, that's where I live. Well, folks, you combo all these different ideas. If you just kind of take a snap back, take a little step back and look at these as little it'd-be snippets of erosion, of trust, of reliability within the system. We are not going to be increasing folks' trust in the system. I get it. Let's get every vote we possibly can, but let's make sure that people are who they say they are. Let's make sure they live where they say they live. And if they don't live where they say they live, that we can pull their ballot out of the pile and not spoil someone else's. Members, we have some good opportunity here to make this bill a heck of a lot better. Let's send this back, let's fix this bill, and let's have some time-honored agreements that election law will not move forward on this House of Representatives unless it has bipartisan support. This bill can gain wide-ranging bipartisan support. If you just change 5 or 10 different items in the bill, I can almost promise you can get Republicans on this thing. We beseech you, members of the majority. We beseech you, members in the majority in the Senate and the governor. Let's do a bill that we can sing kumbaya when it comes to election law in this state. I'm not sure how the rest of the chapters go, but we have some good opportunity here, members. Send her back. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and members for a robust debate on my motion. Representative Stevenson was going to answer a question, but apparently he's still doing his homework. I was hoping to learn more about the penalties for a deep fake accusation or conviction, but we'll have to save that for later, I guess, Madam Speaker. Representative Freiberg indicated that I had helped write the homeless provisions in this bill. I did submit some language that was adopted, and that's because the original language was so vague that it just identified, if I recall correctly, you could just say what intersection you live near, and that would be good enough for your address to vote. While we know that many streets and intersections determine the boundaries of districts, and how could you possibly know what district to vote in, which ballot to poll for that particular district if you just identified an intersection? So yes, we did submit some language because we knew you were going to pass this, and we didn't want it to be so impossible that voters could not even identify where they should vote. Members, we've covered a lot of ground here this evening. I renew my motion to send this, to not adopt this committee report. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The clerk will take the roll on the motion to refuse to adopt.
But that's right.
Will the clerk please call the names of the members voting remotely?
Carroll.
Carroll, no.
Carroll, no. Daniels.
Go ahead.
Daniels old screen.
Daniels, aye. Pulowski.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 69 nays, the motion does not prevail. We are on the Freiberg motion to adopt the conference committee report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading as amended by conference.
Third reading, House File Number 4772, as amended by conference.
Third reading as amended by conference. Discussion to the bill. The member from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Back now to the bill, or the bill itself. I'm going to replow some ground because I think it's important ground. First, as we've all said, as I've said since the very first committee meeting, this work needs to be bipartisan. It has not been bipartisan. Governors and legislators over the past decades have insisted on bipartisan work, and we've failed. This legislature has failed to do this work bipartisanly, and it's a shame. In fact, it extended all the way to the conference committee where there were no Republican conferees from either body. And in fact, much of the language regarding financing was not even approved by the Senate on the Senate floor. Second, this does not improve election security. There's a lot of provisions here that make it easier to vote, but no provisions that make our election system more secure, right down to voting without an address. Finally, we've done nothing to restore public confidence in our election system. There are no provisions in here, so it's really what's missing in this bill that is the biggest problem, whether it be provisional voting, provisional ballots, or other measures that could make our system more secure and give people more confidence that votes were properly counted and properly accounted for, and bad votes could be thrown out. None of that is in this bill. Additionally, there's more spending at a time when we've already spent more money than we have. And there's expensive mandates that are laid on local government. The cost of setting up new polling places, whether they be pop-up polls identified by local government or polling places demanded by college campuses, it all costs money. It takes money to set these up, money that the local governments don't necessarily have. There's some money in this bill, but not nearly enough to cover all the additional expenses. And remember that we've also extended early voting to many more days, more expense for local government, more trouble, and less accountability. Who's going to be watching all those days when these polls are open? We can't expect election judges to sit there for 18 days. It's impossible. Members, this bill leaves a lot of holes. It leaves a lot of things undone that should have been done and does things that didn't need to be done. Please vote no.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a few points. It was brought up that in the bill that you can't take into account if members of a minority or special class do vote well or participate well and are not disenfranchised. In 08 Crawford v. Marion County, election board, Justice Stevens wrote the majority opinion, and the opinion was majorly based on the evidence that every single group that said they were disenfranchised actually voted at a higher rate with the new state election laws. So I think there's a problem with the idea that this bill can ignore a major U.S. Supreme Court case, especially since elections are not just within our state. They are federal elections and have to follow those. Another thing, there was some comments about what? I thought I heard living out of a van down by the river. Well, I lived out of a car, a couple $100 was what the car was purchased for. Lived out of a car for a while, so I have a little understanding of homelessness and the impacts it has on a person. Again, it wasn't a van, it was just a car. And I think that this bill hasn't had sufficient discussion of the appropriate ways to address, such as there are shelters, there are places where the homeless get food and assistance that have been used over many years as the reference of their residents, as opposed to, just picking a point on a map. The other issue, this bill does not address verification problems that we have documented in the state. Back when we had tens of thousands of bad registrations, I sent a letter to the Secretary of State and wanted the information when they analyzed those registrations. And the reply I got was, that's the counties. So I picked the 10 largest counties, added additional 5 counties to give regional coverage, and the reply I got was from the head of the County Auditors Association. We can't do that. The database isn't stable enough. There were 4 or 5 different half reasons why they couldn't. But the result was the tens of thousands of bad registrations every election cycle. They're not checking to see if it's maybe a typo in the address or some other minor issue. They haven't checked and verified that, yes, X number of those did vote in the election, because there's documentation indicating people filed same day, voted early, filing same day, their ballots got counted, and then the federal verification through HAVA at the SSA site found them as bad registrations. This bill is doing nothing to address documented issues with our system, and it does nothing to really address the confidence and concerns about our election system. We should not be approving this. We should actually sit down together and do something that's going to make a difference and improve our election confidence and verifiability. This bill doesn't do it. I'm going to vote no.
The member from Crow Wing, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's getting late. I know we're all tired, but I've got some things to say. Madam Speaker, would Representative Freiberg yield for a question, please?
He will yield. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Representative Freiberg, when we first heard this bill, I brought forth an amendment as far as the precinct maps and I'm sorry, I'm tired, I can't think of the term right now off the top of my head, but I brought forth an amendment saying that if a person's been in prison for 10 years previous, they wouldn't get counted in that district. Redistricting, thank you. That was the word I couldn't think of. And then also if they were going to be in prison for the next 10 years, they wouldn't get counted in that redistricting map. So my question to you is just a very blunt one. Are we moving towards felons in prison voting in the state of Minnesota?
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Davis. Excuse me. It is late. The answer is no. The prison gerrymandering, the bill that requires people who are incarcerated to be counted for census purposes in their last known place of address rather than the place where they are incarcerated has nothing to do with voting. It is just dealing with counting for census purposes.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Freiberg, which absolutely does have to do with voting. I'll move on from that because time's short. So we heard in this bill about school board member vacancies on line 5.20. It starts at special elections for a school board, that you'll have an appointed person for almost up to 2 years. Talk about denying the people of democracy. And I have a sneaking suspicion why this came up, but I'm not supposed to invoke motives to other people. But I've noticed the last few years there were a lot of school board vacancies because parents were very upset. And people who lived in certain school districts were very upset. And so they were coming out in numbers like crazy to school board meetings. And we had a lot of school board members who said, I didn't sign up for this, and they bolted. And then we had special elections for those vacancies. And now all of a sudden, just how coincidental it is that this is now being addressed here this year in the legislature. How if you're just under 2 years, you step down, the rest of the board is going to appoint someone to be on that school board. I just find that very interesting. I'll move to election day registration, and this is the part I want to get to. So in the state of Minnesota right now in current law, because there's probably a lot of us who don't know this, but both paper and electronic voter registration applications must contain the same information unless otherwise provided by law. A voter registration application must contain spaces for the following required information. The name, I won't go into that. Current address, voter's previous address, if any. Date of birth, municipality, county residence, voter's telephone number, if provided by the voter. Date of registration, current valid Minnesota driver's license or Minnesota state ID, or if the voter has no current and valid Minnesota driver's license or Minnesota state ID, so you don't need that. You don't need that. The last 4 digits of a social security number. And it doesn't say a social security card or that you even have to prove it. Just you got to come up with 4 digits. Now you might argue, well, they'll have time if the person fills out a form. This is for voter registration. They can then later verify. However, that's not true when it comes to same-day voter registration. Go on to say 11.7 here of voter registration. It says the paper registration application must provide a space for a voter to provide a physical description of the location of their residence if the voter resides in an area lacking a specific physical address. And we're just looking for the cardinal direction and approximate distance to the location. So before I go to same-day voter registration, I'm going to just point out with voter registration, not necessarily same-day voter registration, but voter registration, you just got to be approximate. Boy, we are not taking our elections seriously. I'm not joking. I could literally weep over this legislation because I know the price that was paid for us to be able to have fair and honest elections. And Minnesota treats it less than dirt. It's not honorable and it's not sacred. Again, I brought this up on the House floor. An elections supervisor in the area I represent, I won't say who, but an election supervisor told me, Ben, if there's going to be cheating, it's going to be on same-day voter registration. It's going to be on Election Day. The so-called, quote-unquote, crown jewel of the state of Minnesota. Think about that. The crown jewel, same-day voter registration, and you all know who says that a lot. The crown jewel of our elections in Minnesota is the very thing that's bringing forth election fraud in the state of Minnesota, and we call it our crown jewel. We have a duty to the people of Minnesota, and broader in a presidential election to the people of the United States of America, to take this more seriously than we are. I'm sorry, Representative McDonald, I can't smile over this. Same-day voter registration. Election day registration. An individual who is eligible to vote may register on election day by appearing in person, by completing a registration application. So they have to complete a registration application, make an oath in the form prescribed by the Secretary of State, providing proof of residence. An individual may prove residence for purposes of registering by presenting a driver's license or a Minnesota ID card issued pursuant to section 171.07. That sounds good, right? Oh, but number 2, presenting any document approved by the Secretary of State as proper identification. To me, that's bad enough right there if it would just stop right there. That's current law, presenting any document approved by the Secretary of State as proper ID. That's given one man a whole lot of power and authority. That power and authority shouldn't belong to one man. But it goes on to number 3, talking about students. Number 4, having a voter who is registered to vote in the precinct. A voter who is registered to vote in the precinct may sign up to, listen to this, they may sign up to 8 proof of residence oaths on any election day. Where am I going with this? I'm gonna put this together for you. So here's what can happen according to everything I just read. Someone can go get registered to vote, not on election day, but just go get registered to vote, and all they have to do is provide 4 digits, a name, and a location. And then they can go vouch for 8 other people on election day. So I'll just give you a scenario. Just pick a homeless encampment. There's someone who got registered to vote in a homeless encampment. And what we find in homeless encampments, you will find illegal immigrants. And so this one person who's registered to vote, which they can commit fraud there, I'll get to that, goes and vouches for potentially 8 other illegal immigrants, people who are not here according to our laws and our rules. And they can go and vote in our election. This is fact, this is truth, this is what you're doing. And I brought this point up in committee, and what I was told was, oh, they don't want a felony. They don't want to get charged with a felony. Really? They came here illegally, and your argument is they're concerned about breaking the rules when it comes to our elections and getting charged with a felony. Well, there's one thing I've learned in the last few weeks. The Democrat Party doesn't take charged felons very seriously. And so we can very easily, right now, in the state of Minnesota, have people voting in our elections who shouldn't be voting in our elections. And now you're making it even easier. Oh, but Ben, the person vouching for those other people, they don't want to get charged with a felony. Well, here's the thing. Before I was a Christian, I had a past life, and I really did hang out with some of the wrong crowds, and some of the wrong crowds would live in homeless encampments and live out on the street. And they could be in one area for a week or two, and then they just move on. So that person that got registered to vote could help those other people get registered to vote and then just move on, including out of the state of Minnesota, and Minnesota is not going to do anything about it. Let me prove it to you that Minnesota won't do anything about it. So in committee, I also asked, because I was told, well, they're afraid of getting a felony, getting charged with a felony, so they won't do it. They won't lie on a registration application. I asked the Secretary of State's office, okay, how many people in the last election were charged with voter registration fraud? The Secretary of State's office did not know. And if you ask me, that would be some very important information for the Secretary of State's office to know. But I was told, well, we're just the Secretary of State's office. We're not the Attorney General's office. See, the Secretary of State's office is in charge of our elections. Don't you think it would be important for them to get information on if election fraud, registration, voter fraud is happening? I think that would be pertinent information. I really do. I don't know, maybe we need to come up with legislation, Representative Murphy or Representative Schultz, on having the Attorney General give us a report. So we asked the Secretary of State's office this information. They got back to us. This is what they came up with. County attorneys report across the state on the outcome of charging decision based on an investigation of alleged violations of voter registration. Last year, they reported the following: investigated 169 cases, charged 10. $169 credible investigations, 10 people charged. You want to know how many were convicted? 0. You're going to have to be quite the salesman to convince me, well, there was 0 because it's not happening. Representative Quam already pointed out, oh no, it's happening. Thousands of bad voter registrations happening in our elections. One of the worst years was 2010, or 2012 was one of the worst years, I believe, if I remember correctly. Tens of thousands. Thank you. Tens of thousands. It's happening. And you know what? The state of Minnesota's not doing anything about it. They're turning a blind eye. I'm not going to turn a blind eye, and neither is this side of the aisle. You're making it easy to cheat in our elections in the state of Minnesota, and you ought to be ashamed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just going to focus on one last issue, one area of this bill that I think deserves a bit more attention. That's a section regarding lobbying. You know, Lobbyists do tend to get a bad rap often in the media and other places, but I think we all know that all of us that do this work here at the legislature depend on lobbyists and the information they bring to us, the expertise they have, the contacts they have to get the information we need. And there was a bait and switch here. We had bad language that was put in the bill last year. There was a fix in both the House and Senate, and that fix was removed in conference committee. If that's not a bait and switch, I don't know what is. You know, if I was the kind of legislator who believed that more government was the answer to everything, I'd really like this, because we've made it harder for the experts to bring us information. At the same time, here in our lobbying provisions, if you're a bureaucrat, you have unfettered access. You can bring all the information you want. You can support the bureaucracy to the ultimate without any restrictions. However, if you're trying to do the work of the people, the real people, you're restricted. Please vote no on this bill.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been a long debate. This bill removes artificial barriers that are in place of voting. You know, I'm surprised to hear how dismissive members are being toward homeless people and their rights. Representative Quam, you were not being dismissive, but you brought up a good example. When you lived in a car, you should have been able to vote. This bill will make sure that young Representative Quam is able to vote. This is a good bill. I hope members will vote green.
The clerk will take the roll on the bill. Will the clerk please call the roll of the members who are voting remotely?
Carroll.
Carroll, aye.
Carroll, aye. Daniels.
Go ahead.
Daniels votes no.
Daniels, no. Pulowski.
Try again.
I can't hear.
One more time.
Daniels, no. Pulowski. Pulowski, aye.
Pulowski, aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 70 ayes and 63 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by the conference committee and its title agreed to. Representative Long.
Madam Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Long moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The House stands adjourned.